In a small, sun-drenched village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there lived a young girl whose presence was as radiant as the morning light. Her name was Luma, and from an early age she displayed an intelligence and wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Even as a child, she asked questions that made elders pause and reconsider long-held beliefs. Her curiosity was relentless, yet it was tempered by kindness and a natural sense of fairness that drew people to her. When she spoke, it was with clarity and purpose, her words carrying an unusual weight, as though each syllable were imbued with truth. Luma was not a girl who shouted to be heard. Rather, her voice commanded attention through sincerity. In the village, she often spoke during gatherings, not to challenge authority for its own sake, but to offer solutions and perspectives that others might overlook. Farmers would listen to her observations about the land and the crops, noting how she could predict the soil's readiness for planting or the subtle signs of an approaching storm. Women who gathered by the river to wash clothes would stop and listen as she shared practical ideas for preserving food, teaching children, and tending animals. Her words were not just advice, they were guidance infused with empathy, and many who heeded her counsel saw improvements in their lives. But Luma's influence extended beyond practical matters. Her words had the power to inspire courage in the timid and clarity in the confused. When arguments broke out over land, water, or village disputes, she would step forward, her tone calm yet resolute. She did not raise her voice in anger, yet every word carried authority. She had an uncanny ability to articulate the concerns of all parties, framing solutions in a way that emphasized fairness rather than blame. Villagers marveled at her composure and wisdom, often saying that her words felt like a gentle wind that could stir the stagnant air of thought, carrying clarity and hope. Naturally, not all were pleased by her growing influence. As Luma matured, her voice became a beacon, both for the inspired and the envious. Some villagers, especially those with authority or status, felt their positions threatened. They were accustomed to unquestioned respect, yet here was a young girl whose words swayed opinions and subtly shifted the village's dynamics. Her intelligence and confidence, coupled with the admiration she received, began to sow seeds of resentment among the jealous. These individuals whispered in corners, remarking that a girl's place was not to lecture elders or offer counsel that challenged tradition. Some feared that her insights might reveal flaws in their governance, exposing their mistakes and inviting public scrutiny. Even within her own household, the tension was palpable. While some family members adored her, celebrating her talents and encouraging her curiosity, others viewed her brilliance with unease. They fretted that she drew too much attention, that her influence might disrupt family hierarchies, or worse, shame them in front of neighbors. At the market, when she offered guidance on trade or barter, on the way grain should be weighed or prices negotiated, villagers would often nod in agreement, praising her ingenuity. Family members who were slower or less astute would mutter under their breath, envious that a child, especially a girl, could speak with such insight while they remained unseen, unheard, and overlooked. Despite the jealousy and occasional criticism, Luma remained undeterred. Her courage was not brash or reckless, it was quiet, rooted in a profound understanding of right and wrong. She knew that speaking the truth often invited risk, but she believed that silence in the face of injustice or ignorance was far more dangerous than any personal peril. Her voice was a shield for the vulnerable, a weapon for the powerless, and a guide for those lost in fear or confusion. When she spoke, it was with clarity, precision, and a compassion that few could resist. The villagers could not ignore her. Children would gather around her to hear stories laced with lessons, while adults sought her perspective on matters large and small. Even the elders, initially skeptical of her youth and audacity, found themselves nodding in reluctant agreement at her proposals. Her influence spread subtly yet powerfully, a quiet revolution that reshaped the village's way of thinking. Some found solace in her counsel, others felt threatened by the power she held merely through words. In many ways, Luma's voice became a mirror, reflecting both the best and the worst of those around her. It revealed courage in the hearts of those willing to listen and the corrosive nature of envy in those who could not. By her adolescence, she had inspired loyalty, admiration, and love, but also bred jealousy, fear, and resentment. Her voice, though pure and compassionate, had become an unintentional disruptor, forcing the village to confront truths it had long ignored. People who once thought themselves safe in silence now found themselves listening, learning, and sometimes trembling, for Luma's words carried weight that went far beyond mere conversation. They carried consequences. Luma's intelligence and courage were not her only gifts. Her empathy and insight ensured that her influence was never abused. She never sought power for its own sake, Yet those around her could not help but feel its presence. Her words inspired action, demanded attention, and even in quiet moments, lingered in the minds of villagers, shaping thoughts and decisions in ways both subtle and profound. Admiration and jealousy danced hand in hand around her, creating a tension that foreshadowed the trials she would eventually face. For a girl whose voice could inspire the brave and unsettle the envious, it was only a matter of time before her power would be tested in ways none could have anticipated. In the village, Luma's voice had become more than just words. It had grown into a force that could no longer be ignored. Each time she spoke, it was as if the air itself leaned in to listen, carrying her truths to every ear willing or unwilling to hear. Her words, though gentle, had a clarity that pierced through the fog of complacency, revealing truths some preferred remain hidden. Elders who had long guided the village with unquestioned authority began to feel unease settle deep within their bones. Their decisions, once accepted without question, now faced scrutiny from a girl they had once considered a child. Luma did not seek confrontation, yet her voice carried weight in every matter of consequence. When customs or traditions seemed unjust, she dared to speak, proposing thoughtful alternatives or highlighting the suffering caused by rigid adherence to outdated rules. She questioned why some were allowed privileges others were denied and why the voices of the meek and humble went unheard. Her words were not challenges for rebellion's sake, they were mirrors reflecting the moral failings of those in power. But mirrors, as the elders soon realized, could cut as deeply as knives, revealing insecurities and hypocrisies long buried under tradition. For many villagers, Luma's observations were illuminating. They found themselves thinking differently about the distribution of food, the treatment of orphans, and the responsibilities of leadership. Mothers and fathers, farmers and tradespeople, began to see patterns they had accepted for generations but never questioned. They marveled at the simplicity and truth of her insights, realizing that one voice, though young, could illuminate the shadows they had chosen to ignore. It was a rare and humbling moment, but it was also threatening for those whose positions depended on silence and unquestioned authority. The elders, once revered and unquestionable, began to whisper among themselves. Fear not at them, not of Luma as a child but of the consequences her words carried. If she continued, they reasoned, the village's harmony could be disrupted, their authority undermined. Every suggestion she made, every question she posed, was like a tiny fracture growing in the foundation of their control. Even kin who prided themselves on fairness began to resent her, seeing in her words a reflection of their own inadequacies and ambitions. Luma's voice had become a mirror, and mirrors, as everyone knows, do not flatter, they reveal. Soon, whispers of conspiracy spread. The elders and the jealous kin met in secret, their voices hushed, eyes darting to ensure no one overheard. "We cannot let this continue," one would murmur. "Her words stir the people, and if the village begins to listen too closely, all our plans, all our power, could crumble." Another would nod grimly, "She must be silenced. Not in anger but in necessity. A village cannot thrive if the young disrupt the balance with reckless truth." These were not idle conversations. They were plans, heavy with calculation and dark intent. The girl's curiosity, courage, and clarity had inadvertently painted a target on her back. Despite the plotting, Luma remained unaware of the full extent of the threat against her. She continued to speak as she always had, calmly, thoughtfully, with an unwavering commitment to honesty and justice. When she questioned why some fields received more water than others, or why certain families were exempt from communal duties, she believed she was fostering understanding, not rebellion. But every observation and every question, though gentle, tightened the coil of fear and resentment among those who wielded power. The more she illuminated, the more fragile their control became. The village's atmosphere began to shift subtly. In meetings, elders would avoid her gaze, muttering under their breath when she proposed new ideas. Kin who once praised her began to frown in silent disapproval, warning others to ignore her comments lest they appear weak or naive. They feared that if the villagers continued to heed her voice, the old hierarchies and traditions would crumble entirely. Children who admired her grew restless when elders frowned, sensing tension but unable to understand its origin. Even the wind through the trees seemed to carry whispers of unease, rustling leaves as if echoing the villagers' hidden fears. It was during these moments of mounting tension that the first hints of active plotting emerged. Elders began meeting late at night, devising ways to curb her influence. Some considered isolating her, limiting her interactions with the village. Others whispered darker ideas, contemplating methods to permanently silence a voice that had grown far too powerful for their comfort. They rationalized it as necessity, convincing themselves that the village's survival depended on quelling her influence. What they failed to recognize was that a voice rooted in truth cannot be easily extinguished, especially when that voice inspires hope, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As these plans solidified, the air of the village grew heavy with suspicion and unease. Luma's every word now seemed to carry more weight than ever before, threatening invisible boundaries that some had built for decades. The jealousy, fear, and ambition of those around her collided in tense silence, creating an invisible storm around the young girl whose voice had become both a beacon and a threat. Unaware of the full measure of danger, Luma continued to speak with integrity, each word unwittingly widening the rift between the truth she championed and the power others clung to desperately. Thus the stage was set. Luma, with her courage, intelligence, and unwavering voice, stood at the center of a village on the brink, admired by some, envied by others, and quietly feared by those whose ambitions depended on her silence. Her words, once instruments of guidance, had become the seeds of upheaval, marking her not only as an inspiration but as a target for those willing to sacrifice morality for control. In the quiet corners and whispered meetings, the plotting began, and the young girl, who knew only the power of her truth, would soon face the full weight of the threat her own voice had provoked. The sun had barely begun its climb above the horizon when the villagers gathered, their faces set with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and a grim sense of duty. Luma stood at the center of the clearing, her small frame trembling, though not from the cold. Her heart raced with confusion and dread, for she had heard whispers in the shadows, rumors of punishment whispered among the elders and her jealous kin. She did not understand fully what awaited her, only that it would be cruel and final, a demonstration of power meant to silence a voice that had become too loud for their comfort. The elders, who had once smiled at her insight and praised her courage, now wore grim expressions of authority. Their hands shook slightly, betraying the inner turmoil of those who enforce cruelty in the name of order. Among them, her kin, those who had once shown her kindness if only occasionally, stood with cold indifference, as if the act they were about to witness had been rehearsed 1,000 times in their minds. There was no empathy in their eyes, only the satisfaction of seeing someone they resented rendered powerless. Luma's own voice, which had inspired and guided so many, trembled slightly as she tried to speak, to ask questions or plead for understanding. But the moment was stripped from her. The elders' decree had already been made, mercy had been abandoned, replaced by ritualistic cruelty. She was seized firmly, though not violently, by the men who had been appointed to carry out the act. Their hands were steady, betraying no hesitation, and they held her as if she were both precious and expendable, a contradiction that mirrored the villagers' conflicted emotions. The executioner approached, an older man whose face was etched with lines of past decisions, many of them cruel and unrepentant. He had done this before, or so he thought, and yet there was a weight in his chest that he tried to ignore. He lifted a small, sharp blade, its edge glinting in the early morning sun, and the reflection caught Luma's eye. In that instant the world seemed to pause. Birds stopped their songs, the wind held its breath, and even the earth beneath her feet felt heavier, as if it too awaited the unfolding of injustice. The first cut was swift, precise, and horrifying in its immediacy. Luma's scream tore through the clearing, a sound raw with pain, betrayal, and disbelief. It was a scream that carried every injustice she had endured, every moment her courage had been met with envy, and every time her voice had been questioned or belittled. The villagers froze, some averting their eyes in horror, others gripping the edges of their clothing to steady themselves. No one could deny the cruelty of the act. The very air seemed to shudder in its wake. Luma fell to her knees, clutching her jaw where the wound had been inflicted. Tears streamed freely, mingling with the blood that stung and burned, her body racked with waves of shock and agony. Yet even in this moment of extreme suffering, her spirit did not break. Her eyes, wide with pain, still burned with the fire of defiance. Though her voice had been forcibly removed from the world, her presence spoke volumes, echoing louder than words could. There was a resilience in her gaze, a silent assertion that cruelty could wound the body but could not extinguish the soul. The villagers were caught in a paradox of emotions. Some felt relief as though justice, however cruel, had been served. Others recoiled, a deep unease settling over them as they realized the gravity of what they had participated in. The act was intended to silence, to eliminate a challenge to authority, yet in its execution, it had revealed something far more terrifying: the cost of human cruelty. Every whisper of laughter, every approving nod, was now tempered with a subtle dread, a sense that they had crossed a boundary that nature, spirits, or fate might never forgive. Silence fell over the clearing. It was not peaceful or respectful, It was oppressive, a heavy, suffocating quiet that made the heart ache. Even the birds, which had cautiously returned to the branches above, were still, as though the very fabric of the village had been altered by the act. The elders lowered their heads, some in shame, others in grim satisfaction, but all were aware of an invisible tension that had replaced the casual authority they once wielded. They had intended to demonstrate control, yet what lingered was fear, a subtle, creeping knowledge that their actions would bear consequences beyond the mortal understanding. Luma, though voiceless, began to communicate in other ways. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the crowd. Each gaze met their own reflection of guilt, fear, or complicity. Her hands, now free to gesture, moved with a strange authority, pointing, trembling, yet commanding attention. The villagers felt an unspoken weight in her silence, as if the absence of sound amplified the magnitude of her presence. Her body, though racked with pain, conveyed a language more potent than words, a testament to endurance, an embodiment of resilience that defied the limitations imposed upon her. The earth beneath her knees seemed to respond to her anguish. Dust swirled in eddies around her, lifted by an invisible wind that carried the first hints of retribution. The sky, still pale with morning light, shifted subtly, clouds darkening in shapes that were difficult to interpret yet impossible to ignore. Even without a voice, Luma had transformed the act of cruelty into a statement. Those who wield pain without conscience invite consequences that extend beyond the immediate moment. As the villagers began to disperse, some glancing back in unease, others quickly retreating to avoid eye contact, the atmosphere remained heavy with dread. Luma remained, kneeling, trembling but alive. Her silence was deafening, and in it resided a power that no blade could cut, no decree could suppress. The act meant to erase her influence had only amplified it, leaving the villagers to reckon with the terrifying reality that a voice, once silenced, could speak through other means, through presence, through spirit, and through the indomitable will of the one who had been wronged. The world had grown quieter for Luma, but in a way that made every sound she had once taken for granted now feel painfully sharp. Her tongue, once the instrument of her thoughts, her laughter and her guidance, had been cruelly taken from her, leaving a void that echoed with absence. She could no longer speak, could no longer warn, persuade, or console with words, and yet her mind remained as sharp as ever, teeming with thoughts, questions, and emotions that had no outlet. At first, despair threatened to consume her. The simplest gestures of communication became laborious puzzles, writing hastily in the dirt, pointing, or attempting rudimentary signs, only to be met with confusion or impatience from those around her. Villagers avoided her gaze, some out of shame, others out of discomfort, as though her presence reminded them too starkly of their cruelty. Her friends, the few who had once admired her wisdom, whispered behind her back, speaking the words she could no longer voice. Each whispered syllable was a reminder that she was trapped not only in her body but in a world unwilling to adapt to her silence. Yet, even as isolation settled over her like a heavy cloak, Luma's spirit refused to bend completely. Her intelligence, her mind's sharpness, became her refuge. She studied the villagers' habits and routines, memorized their patterns and learned to anticipate their movements. Without speech, her observation became more acute, her perception more nuanced. She could see the tension in a lifted eyebrow, the hidden guilt in a fleeting glance, the truth behind words spoken lightly. While the villagers had sought to diminish her influence, her silence paradoxically amplified it. She now understood the subtleties of human behavior in ways they could not imagine. Frustration often boiled within her. She longed to cry out, to confront those who had wronged her, to remind them that intelligence and courage could not be erased by mutilation. The absence of voice sharpened every desire and emotion, compressing them into a concentrated force that fed her resilience. In moments of solitude, she would sit quietly, tracing patterns in the dirt with her fingers, crafting messages she could leave for those willing to decipher them, and devising plans that required no uttered word. Every movement became deliberate, every gesture a potential statement of defiance. Even her frustration was tempered by ingenuity. She began to rely on the power of presence, letting her eyes, her expressions, and her posture convey meaning. A raised brow, a piercing stare, or a slow, deliberate step could communicate volumes. Children, who had once adored her songs and stories, now learned to read her silent signals. They would bring her scraps of food or simple messages from distant places, interpreting her gestures with reverence and care. Slowly, a silent network formed, unspoken but undeniably powerful, centered on the resilience and intellect that no one had been able to destroy. Sleep offered no escape from her predicament. Dreams were filled with echoes of her voice, unspoken words demanding release, and memories of conversations that could no longer occur. Yet even in dreams she strategized, rehearsing actions she might take, analyzing the behavior of those who had wronged her, and envisioning ways to turn her imposed silence into strength. Her mind became a sanctuary, a place where words could still exist freely, unbound by the cruel mutilation of her body. Despite the isolation, Luma found moments of connection with the natural world around her. Birds, whose songs she had once sung along with, became companions. The rustling of leaves, the shifting of shadows, and the whispering winds provided a language she could understand. She spoke to them in gestures and expressions, forming bonds that transcended the limitations of human cruelty. Even without a tongue, she discovered new ways to assert influence, demonstrating that resilience could flourish in the absence of conventional power. In the eyes of the villagers, she was diminished, reduced to silence. But in reality, Luma's intellect and spirit grew sharper and more formidable. The act meant to erase her presence had forced her to adapt, to develop ways of thinking and communicating that defied their expectations. Her frustration became focus, her isolation became insight, and her silent determination grew into a quiet but unyielding power that no blade, no punishment, and no social pressure could diminish. Thus, she endured, a living testament to the fact that intelligence, courage, and resilience cannot be severed from the soul. Even silenced, Luma's mind remained unbroken, plotting and observing, waiting for the moment when her voice, no longer bound to flesh, could reverberate with the force that justice demanded. The village had grown accustomed to silence in Luma's presence, but the nights began to whisper a different story. It started subtly, tiny, almost imperceptible shifts that most villagers dismissed as tricks of the mind. A rustle in the wind when the trees should have been still, a shadow moving just beyond the corner of one's eye, a sudden chill that crept along the spine without warning. At first, these signs were attributed to nocturnal animals or the settling of old huts. Yet as the night stretched on, it became increasingly clear that something unusual, perhaps supernatural, lingered just beyond the grasp of explanation. The animals were the first to betray the shift. Dogs refused to bark at strangers, staring instead at invisible presences. Chickens huddled together, clucking nervously, feathers bristled as though sensing a threat unseen. Cows and goats would not enter the fields, standing at the edge of the pastures, their eyes wide and unblinking, their bodies tense. Birds that normally roamed freely would circle above the village, calling out in sharp, urgent cries, then retreating suddenly without landing. The villagers, already uneasy from Luma's mutilation, began to whisper among themselves, murmurs of foreboding growing with every restless animal. Wind became a messenger of unease. At times, it carried faint sounds that resembled a woman's voice, though the words were unintelligible. It rustled through the huts in unnatural patterns, moving in loops, brushing against walls where no door was open, slipping beneath thatched roofs and unsettling the people within. Curtains swayed though no window had been disturbed. Lantern flames flickered as if disturbed by an invisible hand. Elderly villagers clutched their blankets tighter, whispering prayers, while the younger ones, filled with fear and superstition, would peek through windows, searching for a presence that eluded them. Shadows were the most unnerving. Even when the moon shone clearly, shadows behaved oddly. They would linger too long, stretch in unnatural directions, or separate from the objects casting them. A child's shadow might slide across the floor, pause midair, then return to its owner. During the darkest hours, some villagers swore they saw the shape of a girl moving silently along the village paths, her form insubstantial yet unmistakably human. It glided over rooftops and through the spaces between huts, never touching the earth, never revealing a face, yet its presence radiated a potent, chilling awareness. Fear of that unseen gaze grew steadily in the hearts of those who had once silenced her, leaving an almost constant, tremulous anxiety in its wake. Objects within the village seemed to respond in subtle ways as well. Pots would tilt slightly, spilling water, or lids would rattle though no hand had touched them. Small fires in hearths would flare suddenly, then die down to mere embers, as if responding to a presence unseen but undeniably felt. Even the river, usually calm, seemed to ripple in small, irregular waves at night, as though the water itself was listening. Villagers who approached it at the hour of midnight swore they could hear faint humming, like a song carried from beneath the surface, a song that unsettled the mind and lingered long after the ears had ceased to hear it. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams were invaded by a presence, a silent but commanding form whose gaze could pierce the subconscious. Villagers would awaken with a chill, sweat-soaked, hearts hammering, feeling watched though no one stood nearby. Children cried out for mothers who could not soothe them, and even the bravest men and women would hesitate to move through the darkness, their steps cautious, eyes darting to every corner. The pervasive feeling that Luma's spirit had not been fully silenced infiltrated every aspect of night life, creating a shared unease that grew with each passing evening. Rumors began to spread. Some claimed that Luma's voice, though cut from her body, had found a way into the unseen realm. Others insisted that the shadows themselves had adopted her form, moving as a manifestation of her unbroken will. A few of the older villagers, trembling in their huts, remembered her intelligence and cunning, realizing that the girl they had sought to silence may have only gained a new, more dangerous form of power. Even the most skeptical could not ignore the patterns, the unnerving signs, the restless animals, the whispers in the wind, and the idea that her spirit had returned to claim presence in the village could no longer be dismissed. As the nights deepened, the village began to change subtly. People moved with caution, speaking in hushed tones, eyes always searching. Tasks that once required certainty and confidence were now approached tentatively, the fear of unseen consequence dictating behavior. No one dared speak her name aloud, yet it hung in the air, an unspoken warning. The village had become a stage for her silent influence, and even without voice she was no longer powerless. Luma's presence, intangible yet undeniable, transformed the night itself. She was no longer merely a girl whose tongue had been severed, she had become something more, an unseen watchful force whose spirit whispered in every shadow, sang in the river, and stirred the earth, leaving the villagers in a constant state of tension and apprehension. The signs were clear. Though silenced, she had not been defeated, and the night had become her conduit. Even in silence, Luma's presence began to resonate with a force that could not be ignored. Though her tongue had been cruelly cut, her spirit remained unbroken, and with each passing day, her inner strength grew in ways that the villagers could neither see nor fully understand. It began subtly at first, a door swinging open with no wind, a lantern flickering in rhythm with her heartbeat, a sudden shiver that raced through a room as she passed by unseen. The village, already unsettled by the strange signs that had plagued their nights, now felt an intensity, a quiet but undeniable weight, as though the air itself had thickened in her presence. Her anger, once a private ember, began to flare into a tangible aura that seemed to ripple outward. Those who had mocked her, harmed her, or doubted her began to sense it immediately. A chill would rise along their spines without warning, their hearts pounding with fear that had no visible cause. The wind carried faint echoes of her emotion, brushing against faces, tugging at clothing, rustling hair in unnatural patterns. Even the animals, which had first noticed subtle disturbances, now fled at her approach, instinctively recognizing the intensity of her unspoken wrath. Dogs cowered in corners, chickens shrieked as they leapt to roosts, and birds avoided the open sky, as if the very air had grown hostile. The supernatural elements of the village responded as if they had learned to recognize her will. Fires and hearths flared to life with a sudden gust of air when she approached, illuminating spaces briefly, then dimming as if obeying a silent command. Streams of water, normally placid and calm, rippled toward her presence, bending unnaturally around her as though drawn to her aura. Even shadows, which had once merely hinted at movement, now danced and shifted with intention, stretching unnaturally, curling around corners, or lingering longer than the object that cast them. The villagers noticed these strange occurrences, whispering among themselves, fear gripping their voices. They had tried to silence her, thinking that muting her tongue would end her influence, but they were wrong. Her power had found new channels, invisible yet forceful. Every object in the village seemed to hum with latent energy in her proximity. Pots would tilt slightly, water would slosh inexplicably, doors would creak, and walls seemed to pulse with anticipation. The villagers could no longer ignore that something beyond human understanding had awoken. Those who had once acted with confidence now moved cautiously, sensing that the girl they had tried to suppress wielded an invisible command over the environment. Her anger, grief, and determination coalesced into a silent authority that radiated through the village, a presence that needed no words to make itself felt. At night, her aura grew even stronger. Stars above the village seemed to dim slightly when she walked, and the moonlight glinted off surfaces in sharp, unnatural angles. Trees creaked and bent toward her as if acknowledging her command. Winds swirled in patterns that mirrored her inner unrest, carrying with them the faintest whisper of a voice she could no longer speak aloud. It was a haunting melody, a resonance that clawed at the conscience of every villager who had wronged her. Dreams were invaded more vividly now. Those who had doubted or harmed her would awaken in cold sweats, sensing the weight of her silent, potent will pressing against the boundaries of their own reality. Even the natural world seemed to respond to her emotions. Rivers swelled slightly when she approached their banks, as though nudged by an unseen hand. Fireflies clustered in formations that spelled no letters but conveyed intention, lighting paths with an eerie luminescence. Animals that were not normally nocturnal emerged at her command, silently moving across the village as if sent on errands by her very presence. These were subtle manipulations at first, but they hinted at a burgeoning power that could not be restrained. The villagers, steeped in superstition, began to murmur of omens and curses, their eyes darting constantly to shadows that now moved with intent. Her silent communication extended to humans as well. Villagers could feel her emotions, almost tactile in their intensity. Fear, awe, and respect welled up within them involuntarily, leaving them unable to act boldly. Even those who had never directly harmed her sensed the weight of her anger, a vibration in the very air that made them hesitate before speaking or stepping forward. Luma's power required no speech, it manifested as a palpable presence, a force that commanded attention and elicited obedience without a single word being uttered. Over time, her influence became undeniable. Children who had been indifferent or playful became cautious, sensing that her presence demanded respect. Adults altered their behavior, moving carefully, avoiding actions that might provoke unseen consequences. The village itself seemed to respond to her mood, with the weather, animals, and even the night sky bending subtly to the contours of her silent will. Whispers of her growing power spread, adding layers of fear and anticipation. Those who had sought to silence her now realized their folly. A voice may have been taken, but a spirit that cannot be suppressed will always find a way to speak through the elements themselves. Her inner strength reached a crescendo with every act of cruelty recalled in memory. The village had tried to contain her, to reduce her to silence and submission, but in truth she had grown beyond mere words. Her anger, resilience, and intelligence converged into a force that was both seen and unseen. Every flicker of fire, every ripple of water, every shiver of shadow was now a testament to her indomitable will. Luma had learned that speech was not the only way to wield power. Her presence alone could move mountains, shift currents, and bend the natural world to her command. By the time the villagers truly understood the magnitude of what had been awakened, it was already too late. The signs were everywhere, subtle yet overwhelming, a clear message that the girl they had silenced was no longer bound by human limitations. She had become a force unto herself, commanding nature, shadows, and even the collective fear of the village without uttering a single word. In the silence, she had found the voice of power, and it spoke louder than any tongue ever could. The night arrived heavy with anticipation, a stillness that pressed on the village like a shroud. Luma sat alone in her small hut, her body tense with the knowledge that what had been long suppressed within her was finally ready to surface. Though her tongue had been cruelly cut, her spirit had never been silenced. Over weeks and months, she had cultivated her inner power, a force that had whispered through the shadows, stirred the winds, and bent the elements themselves to her will. And now, on this night, the air felt charged, vibrating with unseen currents that seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat. At first, the villagers noticed only subtle signs. Windows rattled without wind, doors creaked with no touch, and animals stirred restlessly, their unease palpable. Some dismissed it as superstition, others whispered of omens. Yet all felt the change, a growing tension that seemed to suffuse every corner of the village. The elders, who had once sanctioned her mutilation, now whispered anxiously among themselves. "The girl," one began, voice trembling, "she is more than she seems. We may have awakened something." Fear clutched at their hearts as shadows in their homes flickered unnaturally, elongating and curling toward empty spaces where no one stood. Then it happened. A single note pierced the night, a sound so clear, so impossibly strong, that it seemed to roll across the landscape like thunder. It was her voice, carrying not only words but the weight of months of suffering, grief, and righteous fury. The villagers froze, mid-step, mid-breath, paralyzed by the realization that the girl they had tried to silence was no longer bound by mortal constraints. Her voice was melodic yet terrifying, a harmonious blend of beauty and wrath that resonated deep within every soul, shaking the earth itself. The words themselves were simple but filled with power. They called out names, the guilty, the envious, the cruel, drawing them from the safety of their homes. Each syllable struck like a hammer, resonating with the energy of the wrongs they had committed. Windows shattered as her tone reverberated through the walls, fires flickered wildly in hearths, and livestock bolted in panic. Even the river, usually calm under the moonlight, churned and splashed as if responding to her command. The night was alive with her power, and the villagers understood immediately that no one could hide from what she had become. Panic spread like wildfire. The elders who had sanctioned her mutilation cowered in fear, clutching each other as their hearts pounded in terror. They had once believed themselves untouchable, their authority absolute. But now, the voice that had been stolen from the girl was unleashed in a magnitude that far surpassed human reckoning. The younger villagers screamed, trying to flee into the night, yet the air itself seemed to resist them, twisting and bending in response to her utterances. Even the ground beneath their feet seemed aware, trembling subtly as if acknowledging her will. Her voice carried more than accusation, it carried the full spectrum of her suffering and resilience. She recounted injustices, whispered secrets only the guilty could hear, and invoked the very elements around her as witnesses to their cruelty. The wind howled with her anger, whipping through the streets, tugging at the villagers' clothing and hair. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, wrapping around those who had harmed her, constricting, twisting, and amplifying the fear in their eyes. The fire from hearths danced higher, responding to the cadence of her words, crackling in harmony with the raw intensity of her proclamation. It was impossible for anyone to ignore, impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Her voice was a physical force, carrying energy that made bones ache and hearts race. Even those who had been indifferent before could feel it pressing against them, a weight of consequence that demanded acknowledgement. The air was thick with sound and fury, vibrating so intensely that some villagers fell to their knees, weeping, trembling, and unable to reconcile the reality before them with the memories of the girl they had once scorned. The culmination of her speech brought silence. An eerie, complete silence that fell like a curtain across the village once her words paused. In that brief stillness, every ear strained to hear, every eye searched for movement, and every mind reeled from the sheer magnitude of what had transpired. Then came a soft echo, the lingering vibration of her voice, like ripples on water, seeping into every corner of the village, reminding all who remained that silence could never truly hold a spirit as powerful as hers. Some villagers, driven by desperation, attempted to flee into the hills or hide in homes, but her voice found them. It resonated through walls, carried across fields, and slipped into the darkened corners of every dwelling. Their guilt and fear were magnified by the supernatural force she now commanded. No charm, no prayer, no lock could protect them from the repercussions of their cruelty. Every echo of her voice was a judgment, a sentence that bypassed human authority and answered only to the power of her indomitable will. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, the villagers were transformed. Those who had tried to suppress her spirit now understood the profound error of their cruelty. Luma, standing in the heart of the village, her body calm yet her voice echoing through the lingering night, had transcended the limitations that had once sought to bind her. She had become a living testament to the power of the wronged, a force that could not be silenced by mutilation or fear. Her voice was no longer merely sound, it was justice incarnate, a warning embedded in the very air, vibrating through every tree, stone, and heartbeat. When the first light of morning touched the village, her voice finally fell silent, not because it had weakened, but because it had completed its work. The villagers were left trembling, marked indelibly by the night when the girl they had tried to silence spoke, and the village would never be the same again. Her power had been revealed in full. A voice stolen could always return, amplified by the force of injustice and the resilience of spirit, leaving those who had dared to oppress her forever aware that cruelty would not go unanswered. The aftermath of the night she spoke was only the beginning. By the following dawn, the village was gripped by a fear that no words could soothe. Those who had harmed Luma, whether by cutting her tongue, mocking her, or conspiring against her, found themselves unable to move freely. The streets, once bustling with life, were empty, abandoned in panic. People hid in homes, trembling, fearing the unseen force that had been unleashed. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper of wind through the trees, reminded them that the girl's voice still lingered in the air, wrapping around them like a shroud of judgment. Panic was the first to strike. Villagers awoke with hearts pounding, drenched in sweat, gasping as if the night's horrors had pursued them even into daylight. Some tried to speak to one another, but their words faltered, caught in throats constricted by invisible hands. They looked to neighbors for reassurance, but every glance met wide eyes, faces pale and taut with terror. Even those who had not directly harmed her felt the ripple of justice. The village itself seemed to punish, holding everyone accountable for their complicity in cruelty. Illness followed swiftly, as if their bodies were physical manifestations of guilt. Fevers flared without warning, stomachs churned violently and muscles weakened. Those who had laughed at her suffering or dismissed her pain found themselves racked with trembling fits. Children of the guilty cried out in nightmares, parents found their arms useless, and the once proud elders now huddled in corners, shivering with helplessness. Even the animals seemed to sense the retribution, refusing food, howling without reason, and fleeing from the village in fear. Supernatural forces became undeniable. Shadows moved independently of their owners, elongating and twisting toward those who had caused harm. Doors slammed shut by themselves, roofs creaked as if weighted by unseen hands, and small fires ignited in hearths, then flared without cause, singeing walls and scorched floors. The villagers realized with mounting horror that Luma's spirit had not only returned but had extended her reach into every corner of their lives. Every object in their homes seemed infused with a subtle energy, whispering her name and recalling the cruelty they had inflicted. One by one, the consequences fell upon them with terrifying precision. The man who had laughed as her tongue was cut found himself unable to speak at all, his own voice replaced by a haunting echo of hers that taunted him endlessly. Each time he tried to plead, the words twisted, forming accusations that only deepened his torment. The woman who had mocked her appearance was plagued by relentless illusions, seeing the girl's lips moving silently, murmuring indictments too potent to ignore. Her own reflection in mirrors became a vessel for Luma's face, haunting her at every glance. Fear became a constant companion. No one dared step outside alone. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow, was perceived as Luma herself moving through the village. The guilty felt her presence pressing on their shoulders, bending reality to ensure they could not escape accountability. The air was thick with dread. Even the normally carefree villagers could sense the lingering echo of her voice, vibrating in the earth beneath their feet. Each heartbeat became a drumbeat of terror, reminding them that justice was relentless and inevitable. Some tried to flee, but the village itself seemed to conspire against them. Paths twisted, familiar landmarks shifted, and every escape attempt ended with the wrongdoers disoriented and trapped, stumbling back toward the very homes they had sought to abandon. Rivers rose slightly as if driven by her power, puddles reflected images of the past transgressions, and winds carried whispers that recounted every cruel act. The landscape had become an extension of her judgment, a living testament to the consequences of harming the innocent. The intensity of the supernatural punishment escalated as villagers realized no act of hiding, pleading, or bargaining could save them. Fires ignited in barns, food spoiled instantly, and livestock fell ill, striking fear into every household. Every corner of the village reflected her wrath, from the highest rooftops to the deepest cellars. Even the stars seemed to twinkle in warning, casting shadows that pointed accusingly at those who had caused suffering. The weight of her voice, her presence, and her power pressed upon the villagers with unyielding force. Throughout this reckoning, Luma remained unseen, her spirit moving silently but intentionally through the village. Her gaze, though invisible, penetrated every home. The wind carried the memory of her suffering into each guilty heart, reminding them of the cruelty they had inflicted. As they fell to their knees, racked with panic and illness, each realized that justice was not a simple punishment. It was an immersive, inescapable experience designed to teach, to impress upon them the gravity of harming the innocent. By nightfall, the village was transformed. Those who had perpetrated cruelty had been marked physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Some were broken by fear, others by illness, and some by the relentless psychological weight of knowing Luma's spirit could reach anywhere. Families gathered in corners, huddled in silence, too afraid to speak, too haunted to sleep. Even those who had attempted to remain neutral felt the oppressive shadow of justice, understanding that silence in the face of cruelty was also a sin. And so, the reckoning continued until every guilty soul had faced the consequences of their actions. Luma's power, channeled through her regained voice and her indomitable spirit, ensured that the village would never again ignore injustice. Her vengeance was not mere wrath but a careful, precise administration of justice, terrifying, relentless, and unforgettable. By the time dawn broke, the survivors were left pale, fearful, and forever changed, carrying the memory of a night when cruelty met the unyielding force of a voice that could not be silenced. The village would never forget the reckoning. It became a legend whispered in fear, a cautionary tale of justice delivered by the one they had tried to silence. Luma's story, her suffering, and her indomitable voice remained imprinted on the very soul of the village, teaching all who remained that cruelty has consequences, and the wronged can wield power beyond comprehension, ensuring that justice is always served. The morning after the reckoning was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the village, The clatter of pots, the laughter of children, the low murmur of conversations, were gone, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The survivors moved cautiously, each step hesitant, as though the ground itself might shift beneath them to punish another transgression. Their eyes darted to shadows that seemed to twitch unnaturally, and every whisper of wind felt like the echo of a voice they had tried so desperately to ignore. The village that had once been bustling with life now resembled a place abandoned by joy, haunted by the invisible presence of the girl they had wronged. Fear had become a permanent companion. Even those who had not directly harmed her felt its weight, knowing that complicity carried consequences. They avoided one another's gaze, whispered in hurried hushed tones, and flinched at the slightest movement. Doors were bolted early, windows shuttered, and no child played freely in the open. The air was thick with tension. A palpable anxiety settled over every home, every street, every field. It was as though the very soul of the village had been altered, now dominated by the memory of what had transpired. The survivors were haunted in ways that went beyond mere physical fear. Shadows appeared where they should not, stretching unnaturally toward them, reminding them of her silent accusation. Objects moved slightly, as if nudged by unseen hands, and reflections in water or mirrors seemed to carry a life of their own. Some swore they saw the girl's figure at the edge of vision, calm but impossibly present, her eyes boring into them with a judgment that no apology could alleviate. Even in daylight, they could feel her presence lingering, an invisible weight pressing on their chests, a reminder that silence could no longer protect wrongdoing. Nightfall brought a different kind of terror. The village, already tense, became suffused with a creeping dread. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside, and every whisper of wind against the walls was interpreted as her approach. People huddled in their homes, too afraid to look outside, and yet unable to sleep. Dreams were invaded by her image, sometimes a shadowy figure standing silently, other times a face etched in sorrow and accusation. Some survivors woke screaming, hearts pounding, convinced that she had appeared at their bedside. The psychological weight of knowing that the wronged could watch, silently, unrelentingly, made their lives unbearable. Guilt manifested physically and emotionally. The villagers who had plotted, mocked, or abandoned her found themselves trembling at the memory of what they had done. Some became withdrawn, unable to work or speak, consumed by a growing sense of dread that clung to them like a shadow. Others grew irritable and suspicious of those around them, convinced that even their neighbors might be judged for past deeds. No one could find peace, and the communal bonds that had once defined the village began to fray under the invisible pressure of her presence. Even the environment seemed altered, reflecting the unease of those who remained. Birds refused to perch in the trees, animals became skittish and avoided human contact, and crops grew irregularly, wilting in places and thriving in others as if the land itself was complicit in her lingering judgment. The river murmured in a way that sounded like whispers, carrying memories of her suffering through its currents. Every sound, every movement, became a reminder that the girl's essence was woven into the very fabric of the village. Communal gatherings, once sources of joy and celebration, were now impossible. Any attempt at festivity was overshadowed by fear. Survivors whispered hurried prayers, avoided eye contact and refrained from speaking too loudly. Even sharing meals became tense. The memory of her wrath made them wary that some unseen force might strike again if they displayed arrogance or cruelty. The village learned to function under constant vigilance, each member acutely aware that they were never alone in their culpability. Over time, the fear embedded itself into the culture of the village. Parents used her story as a cautionary tale, warning children about the consequences of cruelty, mockery, and silence in the face of injustice. They taught that the innocent cannot be ignored, that even a single act of wrongdoing could ripple outward into unforeseeable consequences. The girl's presence was no longer just a memory, it became a lesson encoded into every aspect of daily life, a moral compass reinforced by the haunting certainty of her enduring spirit. In this new reality, the village had been forever changed. Their lives were overshadowed by the knowledge that injustice left a mark, that cruelty could never be hidden, and that the girl they had tried to silence continued to loom over them. Silence no longer protected the guilty, it only heightened their vulnerability to the memory of her suffering and the manifestation of her power. Even years later, her presence was felt, not physically perhaps, but as a constant, quiet force shaping behavior, instilling caution, and reminding everyone that the wronged could not be forgotten. The village had learned that justice need not be loud to be unstoppable. The girl, though absent in form, remained present in essence. Every survivor carried her memory in their hearts, a persistent reminder that cruelty is never without consequence, and that fear, once awakened, lingers longer than any act of vengeance could hope to reach. In this way her shadow over the village endured, ensuring that her voice, her suffering, and her power remained unbroken, a silent but unyielding force of justice that would guide, warn, and haunt for generations to come.